series looks at the truth behind the legend.
Newland's full voice! I'll take a switch and switch you! Wrong! Shut up! I'll rip your damn guts. I'll fix you. Frenchman anymore, will we?
On the North American plains, opportunity calls men of courage to chase the sun west into a new frontier. They would shape a nation, lay hold of their destiny, and birth a new mythology. But with the passing of time, every myth has its reckoning. Christopher Kit Carson, courageous mountain man and trailblazing scout, thrives in this untamed land. Kit's commitment to friend and country drives him forward, but often leaves a trail of blood behind.
Those familiar with the legend of Kit Carson know him as a mountain man and western explorer, but also a bloodthirsty killer. The truth is more nuanced, however, and the man is far more complex. Carson is a man who values duty over all else, even when that duty conflicts with his own morals.
Every summer, Kit joins his fellow mountain men at a rendezvous set up by the big fur companies.
Show me something over there. Muskets are showing some of that fur.
It's a break from the isolation of trapping and a chance to replenish supplies.
Bring me 5 more of these, and I'll give you the night review.
These giant rendezvous, which were essentially trade conventions, but also giant parties, where a lot of booze was consumed.
Well, why don't you keep it?
Hey, you started it, all right?
There was swapping of women. Marriages took place with Indian squaws, as they were called.
It's at one of these gatherings that Carson rescues a young Arapaho maiden from an attack. Her name name is Singing Grass, and the two are eventually married.
This was the happiest time of his life. He learned their ways, he learned their language. He had found where he wanted to be.
Christopher Kit Carson is born into a world of Western migration on Christmas Eve, 1809, the same year as Abraham Lincoln.
In the early 1800s, the Western territories don't start very far west. They're occupied by native people and European powers, whose presence blocks American expansion. Populating this territory and overwhelming these groups becomes a national priority.
The Carsons land in the settlement of Boone's Lick, Missouri, home of the Daniel Boone clan.
His family was good friends with the Boone family. They intermarried. These were backwoodsmen. They were rough and ready folks who were in search of opportunity.
For his first few years, Kit is confined to life inside Cooper's Fort, an armed camp. 4 years later, his father dies in a land clearing fire. Kit leaves school to apprentice at a saddlery.
He totally disliked making saddles, and he longed for other things. There were a lot of stories about the frontier that would fascinate anybody.
At 16, young Kit heads west, and living by his wits turns a boy's adventure into a man's livelihood.
There probably was not a more dangerous profession in America at that time than being a mountain man. There was the danger of grizzly bears, hypothermia, starvation. These men went into trackless wilderness for months at a time, all in pursuit of beaver pelts.
Kit becomes an expert trapper and lives by a code rooted in tribal warrior culture.
Kit Carson lived true to a code of ethics that is hard for us to understand. It was a very different time then, a very violent time. He was very, very loyal to his friends. He was ferocious to his enemies.
In the Old Testament, it's an eye for an eye. On the frontier, it's counting coup.
Counting coup was between the Native Americans and the mountain men. If you were attacked, you have to reciprocate in kind and even with greater ferocity. This was the way of life for Kit Carson.
In 1840, after giving birth to their second daughter, Singing Grass dies from complications. Without her mother, the baby dies soon after. Adding to Kit's pain, decades of overtrapping have destroyed the beaver population.
Every summer throughout the 1840s, there were fewer and fewer beaver pelts. And this was a consequence of just how amazingly good these guys were at what they did.
We trapped down the river, but found no beaver. The country was barren. It became necessary to try our hand at something else.
Some mountain men head north, others go west, while the worst resort to crime. Carson takes to hunting for a local outpost, but $1 a day is hardly enough for him and his surviving daughter Adeline. The West he once knew has changed. With greater upheaval on the horizon when James Polk becomes president.
I shall assert the right to that portion of our territory which lies beyond the Rocky Mountains.
President Polk had a vision of what America should look like. He wanted all of it. And he vowed that he would get it all, either by purchasing or by war, within one term.
President Polk's agenda is controversial, but well received by business interests both north and south.
This is the execution of Thomas Jefferson's vision for continent-wide expansion. The concept that America is destined to spread from coast to coast. It's a big idea, and for those doing it, a dangerous one. 50 years later, it will earn the political term manifest destiny.
Manifest destiny was probably the most detrimental thing to happen to Native Americans. This idea that America belongs to Westerners, people that were coming in and settling. It makes sense that it would start an all-out war.
At odds with this changing world, Kit Carson brings 4-year-old Adeline back to Missouri. Being illiterate, he's determined to give her the education he never received.
Adeline, I gotta go away, Adeline. I'm gonna leave you here with our family. I'm gonna teach you how to read, how to write. I'll be back, though. You take care of yourself, all right?
The New World has no need of Carson's trapping skills. He's in a fight for survival that will take him through the darkest time in America's history. During the 1840s, the young American nation is experiencing intense growing pains as politicians clamor to seize the vast lands of the western frontier. In the Rockies, where mountain men once thrived, Kit Carson's way of life is fading away. He's left his daughter in Missouri with family, protecting her from the struggle that lies ahead. But on his return trip down the Mississippi, his prospects change.
How far are you taking her?
I am leading an expedition through the Rocky Mountains.
You ever been to the mountains, sir? It's a far piece. It'll probably take you where you want to go.
Well met, sir. John C. Fremont.
Kit Carson.
John Fremont, a lieutenant in the Army Topographic Corps, has been charged with leading an exploration party through the West. He instructs Carson to round up a team of veteran mountain men and native scouts to guide the way.
Carson and Fremont were kind of an odd couple from the start. Fremont is quite well educated, a very flamboyant guy. Carson, on the other hand, is unassuming, has this wry sense of humor.
Boys gonna make it?
He's always giving someone else the credit.
With Carson's help, Fremont maps out a 1,200-mile wagon route through the northern Rockies.
They became natural scouts and men that the government would go to just to know what was out there. They were walking atlases of the United States at that point.
Carson, deliver with the flag.
Look at all that out there. As far as I can see.
By May 1846, Fremont and Carson have become national folk heroes after 2 successful expeditions to blaze the Oregon Trail.
They were the first people to figure out where they could ford rivers, what was the safest route where you didn't have to climb mountains, and they were the ones that led all of the pioneers out to populate and tame the Wild West.
The press dubs Fremont the Pathfinder and Kit Carson his trusty scout.
John Fremont is a media darling, but the true Pathfinder is Kit Carson. Together, their exploits fuel the nation's hunger for stories of Western expansion. But soon their mission to map the Western territories will take on an even greater significance.
On their third outing, an unexpected dispatch arrives from the White House.
It's from President Polk and the Secretary of War.
California. It says we are to continue our fine work in the West.
President Polk is determined to push America's western border all the way to the Pacific by wresting California from Mexico. To the lieutenant's sheer joy, his exploratory mission has just become a military one.
Fremont was essentially an opportunist and someone who saw great glory for himself and wanted ultimately to be the kind of liberator of California.
The news has Fremont so excited that he spends hours rereading the dispatch from President Polk and forgets to post a guard on the camp perimeter. When the long night is over, 3 men in their party are dead. Carson suspects Klamath warriors are to blame.
Carson didn't really stop to look at evidence as to who had done this. He was angry. Kit Carson certainly had a dark side to him. It didn't come out a lot, but when it did come out, it was vengeful.
In retaliation, Carson and these men go on the warpath, and they find a Klamath village not very far away that they completely destroy, and it's truly a massacre. It's kind of overkill in retaliation for the original violence.
Did you get your revenge?
We gave him something to remember.
Just days after the Klamath incident, the United States declares war on Mexico. Navy warships close in on the Pacific coast, and Army troops advance from the east. In California, Fremont and Carson capture the pueblo of Sonoma. Carson rides to Washington to deliver the good news to President Polk. A trip that includes a special stop. Carson is a newlywed, marrying Josefa Jaramillo between expeditions. He's seen her only a few months in the last year. But just as Carson is nearing home, duty redirects his path.
Kit Carson ran into Stephen Watts Kearny leading 1st United States Dragoons overland from Santa Fe to help finish the conquest of California.
We're going back to the West Coast.
Kearny ordered me to join him as his guide. I'd done so. Made me believe he had the right to order me.
Kit leads Kearny's troops back to California, only to discover that Mexico has retaken every city in the state except San Diego. Carney orders an attack, but the Americans are outnumbered. The waning force becomes trapped on a hill with no cover.
Don't take the shot unless you got it.
And dwindling supplies.
It's a desperate situation. They've run out of food. The only thing they have to eat are the mules. And the only reinforcements are about 30 miles away in San Diego.
Carney's last hope is to send a messenger on foot to sneak through enemy lines.
Carson. We need supplies.
I'll take care of it.
Without hesitation, Kit Carson once again follows orders that will change the course of history. During a crucial battle of the Mexican-American War, Mexico has the U.S. surrounded.
No fumar. Eres estúpido ciego. Mantenga su voz abajo.
General Andreas Pico is on alert for Kit Carson. Fremont's published journals that tell of Kit's heroics have made it to Mexico. And Pico is very aware of the famous tracker he now calls the Wolf. Kit is the one man who could foil this victory.
Carson está allá. Ponte listo. El lobo va a escapar.
Bound by duty, Carson, Lieutenant Ned Beale, and Scout Jim Mukta are attempting to get help from the Marines in San Diego, 30 miles away.
We need to get barefoot.
Had to crawl about 2 miles. Having had the misfortune to lose our shoes, we had to travel barefooted in a country covered with prickly pear and rocks.
Just before dawn, the men split up to avoid detection. Then, for 12 more hours, steal their way through 28 miles of unforgiving terrain without food or water.
I need to speak with the commander of this outpost immediately.
This daring mission becomes known as the Crawl to San Diego. It cements Kit Carson as one of America's toughest men. But what's often overlooked is that Kit Carson isn't the first to reach the outpost. He's the last of the three, because Carson chooses the most difficult route, a tactical move that increases the team's chances should his fellow soldiers get killed or captured.
Within hours, 100 Marines rush to Mule Hill, and the Mexican army retreats. A year later, the U.S. wins the Mexican-American War and triples in size, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Largely due to Polk's political tenacity and Kit Carson's efforts on the ground, Manifest Destiny is fully realized. After riding overland to St. Louis, Carson catches a train for Washington to deliver Fremont's field reports to the president.
Washington, D.C. at the time of Kit Carson's arrival was becoming much more sophisticated. And just imagine, this man who had been living most of his life out on the frontier has got to come back to this society. He had to be very uncomfortable.
Off the trail, Kit is a shy, unassuming man, content to keep to himself. In Washington, his celebrity is overwhelming.
there had been all these Blood and Thunder books that depicted Kit Carson as this giant who killed 2 Indians before breakfast and was a caricature.
When you're made into a legendary figure in your own time, there's no way you'll ever be able to reach the top of that pedestal. It's unbearable. After 2 awkward weeks in the Capitol, Carson gets his audience with President Polk.
Mr. Carson, welcome, sir. You have helped carry out the great work of this country. Not many men could do what you did.
I'm not sure since I got here to Washington I've done half what most people say I have.
The president asks Carson to stay on as transcontinental courier.
These letters need to make it to California safely.
I'll do that, Mr. President.
His loyalty has him crossing the country for 2 years, while his old friend John Fremont continues to settle the West. After completing his service, Carson finally returns home to his wife Josepha and builds one of the first cowboy ranches with mountain man Lucian Maxwell.
Mr. Maxwell and I concluded we had been leading a roving life for long enough, and that now, if ever, was the time to make a home for ourselves and our children.
We're coming from the Santa Fe Trail. There's a woman and child. They're both missing. Can you help us?
Once again, duty calls.
Come on.
And Kit Carson answers. The wave of white migration continues to surge west, and clashes between settlers and natives escalate into what becomes known as the Indian Wars. Duty calls Kit Carson from his homestead. He joins the search for a young woman named Ann White and her infant daughter.
The White family got separated from the wagon train they were in. They were attacked by Native Americans, and they were massacred, except for Mrs. White and her child.
But Carson is an expert scout. Kit would look for imprints in the dirt, dung from horses, cinders from campfires.
The formative experience for Kit Carson was when he worked as a mountain man. His ability to track animals then became a very important asset in his ability to track human beings.
Kit Carson may be illiterate, but if there's a story to be read on the ground, he can do it better than most, often riding miles ahead of his own party to move faster with more stealth.
Come on. It's them. There's no time to lose. Yeah.
Still warm. Couldn't have been dead more than 5 minutes.
We found a booking camp in which I was represented as a great hero, slaying Indians by the 100. Mrs. White must have read it, knowing that I lived nearby, must have prayed for my appearance in order that she might be saved.
That's a lot of pressure when you can't do magic and they're telling the people that you're a magic man. Carson's very confident. He's a good leader, but he's not the Superman the dime novels make him out to be.
Mrs. White's infant is never found, and the incident haunts Carson to the end of his days. As the Indian Wars drag on, atrocities mount on both sides. Kid often holds gatherings in his home to help strengthen fractured relations. Fluent in several languages, including tribal sign, he's later appointed a federal Indian agent for the Muesh Utes.
The Utes were a very special tribe to Kit Carson. He absolutely loved them. He rode with them. He hunted with them. He knew them quite well.
In 1858, Carson's world erupts in chaos when gold is discovered in nearby Colorado. Within months, 100,000 prospectors invade the region, and in their zeal to strike it rich, start blasting their way through ancient Ute hunting grounds. At the same time, the debate over extending slavery in the Western territories also intensifies.
Something tells me these boys ain't gonna like this too much.
And the issue of race takes center stage from New York to New Mexico.
Get this tied up here, boy.
Then on April 12, 1861, life changes dramatically when the national argument becomes a civil war.
The war is on! The Confederates fired on Fort Sumter! Take down the damn wall!
Throughout the West, passions run high, and neighbors are forced to choose sides. For Kit Carson, the choice is clear. He stands with his country.
Ain't nobody gonna touch a damn flag!
The Civil War has begun, and the Western territories are caught up in the struggle. Kit Carson joins the Yankee fight.
Ain't nobody gonna take this damn flag!
As colonel of the 1st New Mexico Volunteers, and helps fend off the Texas Confederates. With the rebel threat largely contained, Commanding Officer General James Carlton decides to go after the native agitators who have stepped up their deadly raids while the Union Army was preoccupied.
These Navajo savages, they're far past the point of talking to. They need to be whipped, and they need to fear us.
Carlton believed that the Indians, particularly the Navajos, had to be put on a reservation, essentially turn them into farmers, educate their kids, you'd proselytize them in the Christian faith, and you would bring them into American civilization.
The general selects a parcel of land in southeast New Mexico called Bosque Redondo, or Round Forest, for his grand experiment. If the Navajos refuse to move, Carson is to kill them on sight.
Can you handle that?
To take people from the land that they know and put them in a land that they don't know is disastrous to the way that people live. They aren't able to hunt the same kind of game that they usually hunt. They aren't able to cultivate the same food. A lot of people died once put on reservations.
Carson is in a real predicament here. To refuse a commanding officer is insubordination, and Carson always follows orders. Yet to carry out these atrocities would violate his sense of decency. This is a classic question for soldiers, historically and still today. When must a soldier disobey a command because it's unjust?
Carson actually tried to resign at one point. He said, "I joined the Union Army to fight Texans in the Civil War, not Indians." But Carleton had other ideas for him.
In the end, Carson agrees to head up Carleton's odious campaign. For Kit, perhaps it's the lesser of two evils.
It is going to happen, so it's better me than someone who doesn't care. And I can handle it in a way to maybe minimize suffering. Kit Carson might have had that type of an attitude toward this.
You're that way. I want you over here.
Instead of taking up arms with the Navajo, Carson attempts to starve them out.
Carson realized that he could not fight the Navajo in conventional terms. Instead, he had to fight their land. He essentially had to destroy every cornfield, kill every horse, every sheep, every cow. He had to perform this scorched earth campaign. This was the only way he realized that he could bring the Navajo Nation to their knees.
The merciless campaign drags on for months. What follows is one of the darkest events in American history. General James Carleton has decided to stop the Indian warfare in New Mexico by having Kit Carson force the entire Navajo Nation onto the Bosque Redondo Reservation. Through a devastating scorched earth campaign, the Navajos are starved into submission, and relocation begins.
The Navajos now refer to this, and history refers to this as the Long Walk. And it was similar to a lot of other native removals because it was a hard journey full of disease and danger.
In all, 9,000 malnourished and sick men, women, and children are forced to leave their homes and march 300 miles in the bitter cold. Nearly 500 die during the trip, and many more perish once they arrive. To this day, the Navajo have never forgiven Kit Carson. Perhaps as a form of protest, Kit refuses to participate in the long walk. But it's not enough to ease his guilt.
Carson had a lot of regret at the end of all this. The experiment at the Bosque Redondo was a failure, and Carson realized he had a lot of blood on his hands.
In the twilight of his days, with failing health, Kit goes back to Washington to help negotiate a major treaty for the Muesh Utes.
If he could contribute to the preservation of those who, on some level, he had a hand in destroying, this could free him of the guilt of what he did to Native Americans.
Carson succeeds in securing a large reservation for the Utes on their ancestral land. His final victory in a war of conscience. Then, the soldier returns home.
Carson had this aneurysm on his aorta, which could burst at any moment. So he had to live his last days very carefully.
In a remote army cabin under his doctor's constant care, Carson spends weeks on a liquid diet and finally grows sick of it.
Bring me some of that goddamn meat.
All right, sir.
Near the very end, he realized he was hungry, and he wanted a buffalo steak, and he wanted to smoke his pipe, like in those days as a trapper. He was never so happy as he was when he was a mountain man.
He's a little bit less turpentine in that
Kit Carson dies as he lived, with humor and humility, loyal and selfless to a fault, choosing his duty before personal honor. He's buried in Taos, New Mexico, alongside his beloved Josefa, who dies the month before after giving birth to their 6th child.
Kit Carson is one of the most complex characters in American history. His legend as a bloodthirsty killer created by the dime novels of his time does not tell the whole truth. His epic adventures in war and exploration embody the American spirit in its struggle with national conscience and global identity. The good and the bad that come with the great conquest of the American West are summed up in Carson's life, a legend